In 2024, the Biden administration decided to limit the amount of pollution that individual industrial plants could legally emit. The US Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA for short, estimates that this would save around 4,500 lives annually, to which they assign a monetary value of $46 billion. Putting a price tag on a human life is obviously kind of morbid, but aside from the whole moral conundrum, it's also kind of difficult, which made me curious. How do they actually do that? Okay, but before we start, I want to explain why we would even want to put a dollar value on a life. It's definitely not obvious if you haven't thought about it before. So let's start with a simple example. Imagine that you are a government traffic planner and you want to build a new 2-lane road that creates a direct connection between two small cities. Your estimates tell you that over its lifetime, this road will be driven down 1 million times. So it's no small project. Constructing it will cost about $100 million. A significant budget for cities of that size. Your statisticians tell you that for a road of this type, about 1 out of every 100,000 drives unfortunately results in a fatal accident. So you expect that roughly 10 people will lose their lives on this road. Of course, this assumes that only one person ever dies in such an accident, but give me a break here, I'm trying to keep this example numerically simple. Your statisticians also tell you another thing though. If you were to instead build a different type of road, one that has a physical barrier separating the 2 lanes, the expected number of deaths would drop down to 9. These roads are just a bit safer because they make head-on collisions a lot less likely. But you also know that constructing such a road is more expensive. They need to be a bit wider so you can fit the barrier, and so you need to buy more land, spend more time paving, and that's before you consider any of the additional material costs. The project would now cost you $110 million. Now you're in a tough position. You could spend $10 million to save one future life. Do you do it? What if the cost wasn't $10 million but $50 million instead? Or what if it was $10 million but you'd actually prevent half of all collisions, so you'd save 5 lives instead? Is $2 million a fair price for a life? Or is $50 million fair? Or is it $10 million after all? I think a lot of people's intuition would say that no amount of savings is worth the cost of one life, but if that was the case, we wouldn't even have roads to drive on. Building a road that's so safe that no one can ever possibly die on it is just not economically feasible, so we have to draw the line somewhere. And of course, roads aren't the only place where we have this concept. This is basically applied anywhere where there's risks. How safe do you want your factories to be for your workers? How reliable does the safety engineering in your car need to be? Or how rigorous do you want your medicine to be tested? We don't have infinite resources, so we need to draw the line somewhere for all these things. Okay, but that leaves the question. How do they actually get to a number? Well, it turns out there isn't just one standardized way of measuring it, and every organization and country kinda does their own thing, but there is 2 really common methods. And the first one is just asking people how much they value their own life. Okay, so obviously you can't just ask people that directly. Apart from the fact that they would probably be mildly threatened by the question, they would also just tell you it's worth all the money in the world. So you have to try to tease it out with sneakier questions. The EPA, for example, says the following. Suppose each person in a sample of 100,000 people were asked how much he or she would be willing to pay for a reduction in their individual risk of dying of 1 in 100,000, or 0.01% over the next year. Since this reduction in risk would mean that we would expect 1 fewer death among the sample of 100,000 people over the next year on average, this is sometimes described as 1 statistical life saved. Now, suppose that the average response to this hypothetical question was $100. Then the total dollar amount that the group would be willing to pay to save 1 statistical life in a year would be $100 per person times 100,000 people, which is equal to $10 million. Actually, we can do a small field experiment right now to determine the statistical value of the life of the average commenter on my channel. With my YouTube audience page and a bit of statistical malpractice, we can figure out that my average viewer has about a 0.05% chance of dying within this year. So let's say I want to sell you a pill which halves your chance of death this year, so it makes it 0.025%. But it doesn't affect your health in any way, shape or form after that. How much would you be willing to pay for that pill? If you have an answer to this, please write it in the comments and maybe also write which country you are from so we can make it comparable. I would be really interested to see if we get values that are anywhere close to what the actual studies get on this. Anyway, essentially you're just asking people how much they would pay for a slightly lower chance of death. This is called stated preference because, well, you kind of just ask people whether or not they prefer $100 to a slightly lower chance of dying. But there is another way where you don't have to rely on what people tell you about themselves, but you instead look at how they behave. This is called revealed preference because people, through their actions, reveal how they truly feel about these things. This is obviously quite complicated, and there are a ton of ways of doing it, like looking how much people spend on preventative health or safety equipment, but the most common one is looking at wage differentials. In short, how much more do you have to pay someone to do a more dangerous job? The statistical methods for this are super complicated, but in simple terms, you just look at people over time and see how much their wage changes when the risk level of their occupation goes up or down. Let's say you're an electrician making 50 grand a year, and as far as electrician jobs go, yours is relatively safe. But there's a new position opening in your company, which is servicing more high-risk locations like power lines and radio towers, where there's a small chance of death or injury by falling. When your boss asks you if you're interested in that position, what salary do you ask for? You probably want a raise, after all it's more dangerous than your current job, but do you ask for 55 grand or do you go for 75,000? By observing thousands of people making such choices and comparing it to the mortality risks of those jobs, we can get a reasonable estimate of how much the average person values their own life. Of course, most of these estimates don't just look at one thing, but they instead get a ton of different estimates from a ton of different studies that use both revealed and stated preference methods, so they get a much more complete picture. But enough technicalities, let's look at what a statistical life is actually worth. When I first learned that for some reason every US institution has their own estimate, I was thinking they would be wildly different, but it turns out they are actually super similar. The EPA, which we mentioned earlier, uses a value of about 7.4 million US dollars, but those are 2006 US dollars since that was when they did their review. This comes out to just under 12 million in today's dollars. In the US, that's actually the lowest I could find, with the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Transportation, and the Department of Homeland Security all coming in a bit over 13 million. It gets more interesting though when we compare internationally. I was too lazy to look this up for all the countries individually, but Wikipedia is nice enough to provide a list of estimates for all European countries from the European Rail Agency. What's interesting here is that the values are generally much lower than those for the US, with the highest estimates coming from Luxembourg with around 6.5 million euros and the EU average around 3.3 million. Now, if we account for inflation, since these are 2016 euros, and exchange rate, this comes out roughly to 5.2 million USD, which is still less than half of what it is in the lowest rating for the US. Well, I heard about the cost of living in the US, but I didn't know it was this bad. Jokes aside, historical data from the US suggests that the value that people put on their life grows with income, but it does so at a much faster rate than income itself does. As I've discussed in my last two videos, the US is generally richer than Europe, so that can probably explain some part of the difference, but even very rich countries in Europe tend to have lower values than the US. So it's probably not all that's going on there. If you happen to know why this discrepancy exists, please leave a comment. I would be super interested. I think many people have the intuitive feeling that Europeans and Europe cares a lot more about safety and regulations than the United States does. And obviously this isn't the only factor, but I still found it quite surprising. Anyway, just thought this was interesting. See you in the next one.